Welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, a rare meeting of the DPRK ruling party Congress. Leader Kim Jong-un is expected to formally announce new policies in a bid to solidify power before a possible nuclear test in the coming weeks. What should we expect? And Japanese Prime Minister Abe arrives in Russia ahead of the G7 summit. The two countries have yet to settle a World War II-era territorial dispute, but shifting geopolitical priorities may catalyze resolution. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK, is holding its first party congress since the year 1980. The event presents a major opportunity for outsiders to see the country's vision for itself, at least to a certain extent. After all, it's been nearly 4 decades since the last gathering of the party's highest decision-making body. Before our discussion about what it means and what it might mean for others, let's take a look at this.
A long-awaited gathering. The 7th meeting of the Workers' Party of Korea, which is the party's highest decision-making body, began in Pyongyang on Friday. It's the first meeting of its kind in 36 years. Expectations are running high. Foreign journalists have been invited to cover the closed-door meeting, but have not been permitted inside the building where the Congress is taking place.
We are very happy and proud that this honorable revolutionary tradition established by our great leaders is adding luster to our country, and that our respected comrade Kim Jong-un is holding up our country as the #1 in the world.
The Congress is expected to last 4 or 5 days and will likely promote a dual policy of developing nuclear weapons while building the country's domestic economy. There will also be possible personnel assignment changes.
1990년도나 85년도 이 정도의
The 7th Party Congress should have taken place around 1990 or 1985. At that time, under the circumstances in which the socialist nations collapsed, DPRK could not hold the Congress, which was in the form of a festival. And during the 1990s, Kim Il-sung died on July 8, 1994, and DPRK was going through the DPRK famine, and was in a very economically challenged situation.
The Workers' Party of Korea has held 6 congresses before. The first congress took place before the DPRK was established and announced the formation of the Workers' Party of North Korea. The second congress also took place before the country officially split and focused on repairing the divisions created by the Soviet Union and US occupations of the North and South. A year later, after the DPRK had established itself, the party merged with the Workers' Party of South Korea, giving birth to the Workers' Party of Korea. The third Congress decided on the objectives of the 5-year plan for the national economy. It also set forth the task of building the foundation of a socialist industry. The fourth meeting emphasized opposing revisionism, factionalism, parochialism, and nepotism. The 5th Congress delivered a report setting the so-called 3 revolutions: ideological, technological, and cultural revolutions for strengthening the country's development. The 6th Congress was held in 1980, the last one before the current meeting. The DPRK's then leader Kim Il-sung proposed an alternative democratic Federal Republic of Korea that would merge the DPRK and South. He also announced Kim Jong-il as his successor. This current 7th meeting comes after months of tensions following Pyongyang's 4th nuclear test explosion in January. The event presents a major opportunity for the DPRK's young leader Kim to move towards setting his own personal tone of leadership. Tensions on the Korean peninsula are likely to rise as the North looks set on building its nuclear capacities.
For more discussion about the DPRK's Workers' Party meeting, we are joined here in our Beijing studio, Mr. Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Mr. Yang visited DPRK several times during the very beginning of the 21st century. In fact, in Pyongyang, I met with several ministerial officials. So great to have you, sir, here with us to provide your insights. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., we're having Yoongjang Lim, who is a lecturer of Korea Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Ms. Lim is originally coming from South Korea. Also joining us from Washington, we're having Mr. Dr. Alexander Masurov, who's an adjunct professor of security studies at Georgetown University. Welcome to the three of you. This is a big day for DPRK. It is after 40 years, the party congress finally convenes. But what can we expect, Mr. Yang? First of all, how much would this party congress mean the solidification of power for the young Kim, the current president?
Well, for the top leader, the young leader, today's Congress will mean the formal setup, the new leadership. Whenever we talk about the power transition, if you we say, oh, the power transition has been completed. Yes, in terms of one person to one person, say the one top leader to the other top leader, the power transition has been completed already. However, if we talk about power transition in terms of generation of leadership, it's far from complete. So this Congress will clear signal that at least that will be the beginning of the new leadership under the new leader, top leader.
Mr. Yang, if I understand right, you are the expert here, but if I understand right, there are certain positions that Kim Jong-un already holds. One is the first secretary of the party, which of course is solidify his power inside the party. And secondly is the chief commander of the army. 1 million strong inside the DPRK. And now during this party congress, it is not only about his personal status, but also about, as you said, the new generation. What about the new generation? How is it likely to come out? There's going to be a central committee likely to be selected by the Congress.
Central committee.
And then on top of that, it is going to select the Politburo.
Politburo, and elect Politburo elect presidium. That will be composed by the 5 person.
Right.
The 5 person will be the top 5, something like top 7 in China.
All right.
So basically, this Congress should be expected to produce or elect 3 levels of leaderships, say Central Committee of the party, and above the Central Committee, Politburo, and the core of the leadership is a presidium. And now, there are 2 problems. One is the aging problem. Most of the senior officials are also very senior in terms of years, and also there are some vacuums. For example, at the top 5, several vacuums remain unfilled. So,
Ms. Lim, from the South Korea's perspective, what are the things that you are observing? What are some of the signals that might be coming out of either President Kim's speech and the latter elections that would give us a strong interpretation about what exactly is going on in DPRK and what kind of potential they are looking at?
Yes. First and foremost, Kim Jong-il, his father, he's died in the December 2011, and Kim Jong-un got this, current titles in the April 2012. So it has been almost like 4 or 5 years, since he got a kind of leadership of the whole country. But the thing is, as Mr. Yang pointed out, this aging problem is one side, and he also wanted to show that this kind of young and vibrant and energetic leadership, not only just to his own domestic society, to also the international society as well. So of course we cannot precisely predict which person will be in the what position. For example, many other experts guess that his younger sister Kim Yo-jong, who is now in charge of the propaganda, she might be more elevated, more promoted, but who knows? It's a kind of black box country, and they didn't even allow the foreign correspondents to come in in the Congress. But we would have to take a look. But the biggest thing will be, again, he wanted to show his young and vibrant and at the same time solidified leadership to the rest of the world too.
Dr. Mansurov, at least there is one thing that people are extremely interested in, that is whether through this party congress with the solidification of power and the new era so-called politics in the DPRK. Whether the so-called Bingjin is still going to be the policy of DPRK is a big question. Just to explain to our viewers, Dr. Mansurov, what exactly Bingjin means in plain English, if you can, and what would that mean, the nuclear weapons vis-a-vis economic development from the American perspective?
Okay, Pyongyang line, which was announced by Kim Jong-un when he, a few months after he took over back in 2012, essentially means the parallel development of economic construction and nuclear armament. Basically, the leadership said we want to do both. We want to grow our economy, rebuild and grow our economy, and at the same time take care of our security by enhancing the nuclear deterrent. Whether he will be able to do it, it's a big question mark in everybody's mind. From the United States and its allies' position, it's impossible to basically have his cake for him and eat it at the same time. But if you look around the world, Kim Jong-un is thinking that's essentially what everybody else is doing. The United States, China, Russia, South Korea, every other country in the world tries to develop its economy while enhancing its military power. And so he doesn't want to be an exception. And again, whether he will be successful or not, time will tell. But at this Congress, I don't think that they're going to change this policy. Probably it will be codified, and it will be put in the context of the North Korean historical development.
I see. I was reading some specific news articles coming out of the DPRK side before coming into the studio. Mr. Yang, help us to understand this. There's some specific message coming from what they call the Committee for Peaceful Unification of the DPRK. And there's a specific statement related to the Bingjin policy we talked about. And quote, regardless of whether someone recognizes or not, the DPRK, our nation, is already a nuclear state that is armed with H-bombs. That cannot be changed, end of quote. And obviously this is a specific organization from the government that's releasing this statement, nothing new there. But before this party Congress, well, as it's being convened, this seemed to be a reaffirming message about the nuclear weapon development hand in hand, quote unquote, with the economic development. But Mr. Yang, let me ask you this. Because of the international sanctions, is it possible that you have a hand-in-hand relations from your perspective, nuclear weapon development and also economic development, which would mean, to a certain extent, DPRK has to open its door and others have to also embrace the possibility of work with DPRK?
Well, this is not a key question to me, the key question to DPRK, Ideally for DPRK, they want both, development of both parallel achievements, say nuclear weaponization and modern economy. However, in reality, both of them are in contradictional structure, say zero-sum game. Economically, any increased inputs to reduction to economy and vice versa. And politically and strategically, if you want to really modernize your economy, you need to open, just like the young leader has done. Say, when his father was in the office, he opened cautiously 2 special economic zones, one for South Kaesong for South Korea, the other Rajin for China, only 2. When the young leader took into office, every province opened a specific zone. Okay, nationwide open.
Right.
However, under the sanction regime, especially under the newly introduced 2070, so how business people dare to input such a very promising market? No way. So basically, the nuclear development has become a fundamental obstacle blocking every great opportunities for their economic development. So basically, that is opportunity cost for DPRK.
Ms. Lim, usually the South Korean studies the North Koreans better than most of us, at least historically. So let me ask you about this. What are the economic realities of the DPRK besides just the GDP numbers? I mean, what areas are trading on? What do they rely on when it comes to GDP growth? And also, what kind of potential can they tap into if their economies is more open? Ms. Lim.
Sure. Yeah, as you pointed out, there are many South Korean experts actually who are studying in the North Korean economy. Of course, as you briefly mentioned, I mean, the GDP growth rate kind of number sometimes can mislead us because, you know, those numbers does not actually fully reflect what the reality is and on the ground. So, of course, in terms of the, again, the growth rate, I mean, they might have shown certain growth. But again, I don't think that numbers indicate the real actually improvement of the people's life. The reason why I can say this is, you know, their economy is already I call like this way, the court economy run by these party people or party leaders, and the just, you know, normal or market for ordinary people are totally separated. So here the point is all this, you know, new rising 돈주 money master like people who hold financial power. Of course, they can somewhat contribute this kind of, you know, number. But again, I don't think those numbers fully reflect the realities.
Right. Talking about the numbers,
we're talking
about the numbers. We do need to demonstrate a little bit what kind of numbers we have on hand.
Yes.
We do not know whether they are accurate or not. Economically, the DPRK is said to have been improving its economy according to a South Korean organization, South Korean Central Bank. GDP growth of DPRK has been around about 1% annually. Look at that chart.
Right.
But the country's 2015 GDP could be surprisingly high, some suggest. The South Korean think tank, the Hyundai Research Institute, predicts that the figure is around 7%, which is quite surprising. Ms. Lim, very briefly to us, what exactly, where does that come from, 7%? If it's accurate, we don't know yet.
Yeah, presumably raw material export and these, you know, mining industries. All these things are again the pretty occupied by pretty money power class people. So they already sometimes playing with the market, international market as well. It's not my own statement. It's basically based on what South Korean economists are researching on.
All right.
So there are, of course, it's different from the entrepreneur in the Western society, but there are certain people, I mean, who are doing this kind of business with the international market.
Mr. Mansurov, having said that though, what would that mean? I mean, after this party congress, after probably the reshuffling of personnel, the elections, the solidification of power, the new generation of leaders so-called coming into power, can DPRK have a chance of adopting a different approach? At the very beginning, everybody understanding to solidify power, probably certain deeds and actions have to be taken. But now it seems to be already at the first page. Is there a slim opportunity that things can turn otherwise, Mr. Mansurov? Or am I wishful thinking?
Yes. No, first of all, let me go back to your previous question about the economic situation. North Korea is doing better. An average North Korean citizen today has a better life than he or she had 4 or 5 years ago under Kim Jong-un's father. And we see it, you know, there is an uptick in the energy production. They're commissioning new power plants. They have better harvests year after year after year. Again, the labor is extremely mobilized, I agree. They're easing up the labor restrictions, and so we see more mobility on the labor markets. But fundamentally, I think this growth is fueled by an exponential growth in trade and investment from China. And so the question remains whether, you know, if China seriously begins to enforce international sanctions, whether that dynamics will continue on. So that's one. So if you look at Kim Jong-un's thinking, basically his economy has been growing. I mean, his people are doing better in his mind, and you know he is rebuilding his military. You know, essentially enhancing his nuclear deterrent, developing its missile force. So yes, there are some costs he has to pay in terms of the relationship with his neighbors, but his neighbors never really liked North Korea, and his country is accustomed to living in the kind of isolation which it confronted recently. So in his opinion, really, he doesn't have to change much. The revolution continues, and that will be the message of this Congress, that the Congress is about the revolution which is continuing forward.
Okay. Mr. Yang here, since Mr. Mansurov directly pointed to the Chinese side, so I'll let you respond. It has been a myth as to how much swaying power Beijing has over Pyongyang. And it has been a myth about how much power China has in terms of command of six-party talks, or three-party, four-party, five-party, whatever the format. What exactly is the cards China has on its hand in terms of working with the international community and bring DPRK back into the international community?
Okay, let me put it by this way. Firstly, China's influences on North Korea is really limited, not so as many external observers think or observed. And secondly, the cards in Chinese hand are fewer than those in hands of DPRK and Americans, simply because the nuclear issue, peaceful solution to the nuclear issue, the leverage is, we do have some economic ties, and we are reducing because of the sanction regime. However, the whole picture is what North Korea want, mostly in American hands, and whether or not given right power is in North Korean hands. So basically, we need to increase dialogue. China's cards is China is a commonly accepted mediator to encourage, to facilitate talks that will pave a way towards the peaceful solution.
And my first question, I want to address it to you, Mr. Mansurov, if you can, very briefly. Since Mr. Yang already talked about the cards that's also in the hands of the DPRK and the United States, we do not have any guests coming from DPRK, unfortunately, not for today. But from the U.S. perspective, at what level the communications are being done right now? Are there under the table discussions going on? Are there real exchanges between the two sides, Pyongyang and Washington, just to make sure the hope is not going to be eternally dim, Mr. Mansurov?
As far as I know, there are very few official contacts through the New York channel. Again, on track 2 level, track 1.7 level, if you wish, there are some contacts, but I don't think they're getting us anywhere because the positions are so starkly different. And I really, I'm pessimistic about the future of the U.S.-North Korean conversation.
1.7, 1.8 to 2.0, whatever it is, we really hope something might work, at least in the future. For now, thank you so much for your input about the analysis of the recent Party Congress in DPRK. Yang Xiyu, Yongzhang Lim, Alexander Mansurov. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend. Thank you. Stay with us here on World Insight. We've got our final segment coming right up. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe meets with President Putin of Russia ahead of the G7 meeting. The two countries have yet to settle a World War II era territorial dispute, but could shifting geopolitical priorities force progress? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is currently meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin at Russia's Black Sea resort of Sochi. The two leaders will discuss issues such as territorial disputes, trade, economic cooperation, and interaction on international affairs. Disputes, though, over islands in the Pacific prevented the two sides from inking a peace treaty after World War II, but circumstances may be changing. As U.S. ally, why is Japan putting itself in the diplomatic crossfire between Washington and Moscow, particularly at this moment? Before turning to our panel, let's have a look at the Abe and Putin meeting.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has arrived at the Black Sea resort of Sochi for a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. This marks the 13th time the two have met, compared with 7 meetings between Mr. Abe and President Obama. Before the meeting, both sides voiced their expectations for this high-level meeting. Mr. Abe aims to create a new phase in their bilateral relationship, and the Russian side has made Japan a priority in their foreign policy. During their talks, the two plan to discuss a historical territorial dispute. Russia calls these islands the Southern Kurils, but to Japan, they are known as the Northern Territories. The Soviet Union seized them in 1945 under the Yalta Accord. Japan views this as an illegal annexation. Due to the dispute, Russia and Japan have never officially signed a peace treaty to end World War II.
It depends if Japan will finally recognize Russia's formula, which sounds that no territorial issue could be solved without the frame of the peace treaty. So it means that the territorial issue should be discussed within the text of the peace treaty and then go on.
Mr. Abe will also lay out a plan for 8 areas of cooperation to boost the Russian economy, including energy and industrial development in Russia's Far East. As America's ally, observers say Japan is trying to pull off a balancing act between Washington and Moscow. The U.S. continues to impose sanctions on Russia. The timing of the meeting with Mr. Putin is also particularly delicate for Mr. Abe, as he will be hosting the G7 later this month. The gatherings used to be billed as the G8, including Russia, but Mr. Putin was uninvited 2 years ago after the Crimea issue. The growing relationship between Japan and Russia poses interesting questions regarding the regional geopolitical balance.
Yes, indeed, a very interesting situation over there. We're joined talking about Japan and Russia ties. In Moscow, we have Mr. Dmitry Barbich, who is a political analyst from Sputnik International News Agency. Welcome. And also in Tokyo, we would also like to welcome Professor Takasato Watanabe, Professor Emeritus for the Department of Media Study at Doshisha University. Professor, welcome as well. Gentlemen, it's an interesting situation, isn't it? We're going to see Japan to host the G7 summit, which involves heads of state, but of course without Russia's participation. So why is Japanese Foreign Minister Mr. Abe rushed to Russia now? What is likely to be consulted, and will they ever work? Professor Watanabe.
Yes, this is very, delicate matter for the politicians of Japan. Actually, Mr. Abe's wish or idea to talk with Mr. Putin is to set up only the channel of talking. Without that, the Japanese people, public opinion, does not permit him not to have any channel with China and Russia. So this is for the setting up the channel to talk directly between the two leaders, Japan and Russia, the first one. Second one is that Russia wants to have economic development and needs Japanese economic investment in the Asian part, eastern part of Russia. And Japan also is put into the difficulty in management of the Japanese economy by the failure of Abe's economics. So the feeling of Mr. Abe is to put some, dream or illusion to the Japanese people that he is succeeding in many ways.
But Mr. Barbich, will that be a success, the consultation? Will there be real content coming out of these rounds of consultations?
I think there is already a success for the Russian side, because the Bloomberg agency reported today that Obama, the American President Obama, specifically asked Shinzo Abe not to come to Moscow. He warned him against coming to Moscow. But Abe obviously considers Russia an important country which cannot be ignored. So he came to Moscow, and the topics to be discussed look very much like G7 topics. They're going to discuss not just bilateral relations, but, for example, Syria. I think it's obvious to anyone that the Syrian issue now cannot be resolved without Russia. As for the bilateral ties, I think that Japan just doesn't want to stay out of the big development projects which Russia and China have been working on during the last few years. Let me remind you that it was in 2014, already during the period when the United States to reduce its ties to Russia, it was in 2014 that Russia signed an agreement with China on natural gas supplies to China. This agreement was worth, as you remember, hundreds of billions of dollars. This gas could also go to Japan, but it didn't. So Shinzo Abe wants to improve his image. He doesn't want to create an impression that Japan is going to stay out of the big development projects in Southeast Asia.
So from your explanation, Mr. Barbich, it seems that for Moscow, the priority is whoever is with us, not working necessarily with Washington, will be a priority for us to deal with. Not to mention that you have your territorial disputes with Japan. You also have several issues related to Japan. Is Japan, from Russia's perspective, a dependable and reliable partner in terms of economic and political cooperation?
Well, I can tell you, of course, Russia wants to have good relations with Japan, and you know, formally the state of war between the two countries was ended in 1956 at the San Francisco conference, and we have bilateral trade. It used to be $30 billion before the United States forced Japan to join sanctions against Russia. Now it's about 20 billion, due also to the fall in the oil prices. But in general, of course, Russia wants to have good relationship with Japan. However, Russia wants to support justice in this region. So, for example, if the United States and Europe shut their eyes on the attempts of a part of the Japanese elite to remilitarize Japan, Russia doesn't shut its eyes on this. In this issue, Russia rather stands together with China. Russia wants to, Russia doesn't want to be aggressive with Japan. There is no talk of any possible confrontation between our two countries. But of course, Russia wants, for example, the Japanese atrocities in China during the World War II to be recognized as acts of genocide, which was the case, unfortunately. As for the territorial dispute, I can give you the comparison. China also had a territorial dispute with Russia, but thanks to friendly relations, China got its territory back. Japan adopted the very attitude which the United States wants all the countries to adopt towards Russia. Confrontation, we won't sign the treaty until you return us the islands. So the islands are still there for obvious reasons.
Very interesting over there. Of course, every country's geopolitics is being conducted for the best national interests of that country. That is just a theory that we all accept. Having said that, though, Professor Watanabe, how shall we understand Prime Minister Abe's effort, particularly when Mr. Barbich talked about President Obama do not necessarily favor Prime Minister Abe's trip to Moscow, at least to Sochi, and yet the latter did make it. What would that mean for the U.S.-Japan ties temporarily? Or this is probably a duet in a way that has been much long planned?
Yes, there are two elements of the direct meeting between Mr. Abe and Mr. Putin. The first one is that Mr. Obama is already a half lame duck because the next president campaign is going on. And number two is that for the United States, China is the main hypothetical enemy. So that if Mr. Abe goes to USSR, now it's Russia, and has a talk with the leader of Russia, Mr. Putin, it means that the relations between China, Russia, and the United States and Japan, Japan can play a bit more in the place of the United States against China. So that this is very delicate. One more thing that I want to say that Mr. Abe did many things with the United States, saying that he must follow his grandfather. For Russia, in 1986, Mr. Abe's father, Shintaro Abe, then the foreign minister of Japan, went to Russia and the talks to further promotion of the friendship. Then Mr. Abe is very, very emotional person.
I see.
So this kind of things are complex.
Very interesting. Besides the family history, Abe will lay out the plan of 8 areas of cooperation to boost the Russia economy, including energy and industrial cooperation. Let's take a look at this. Trade is shrinking rather. Between 2015, Russia is buying fewer Japanese goods, particularly cars, while Japan is paying less for Russian oil and gas. Of course, earlier, Mr. Barbich already explained to a certain extent how that came into being. But one thing is very important. That is, what can be the result of this kind of consultation if the priorities of both countries, Russia and Japan, are already very clear? Is this just a geopolitical tango aimed at a show, or this is actually some real interest likely to be traded? And if traded, what would that mean for the other partners and priorities of these two countries when it comes to geopolitics? May I go to you, Mr. Barbich, first, briefly, if you can.
Well, I would like to say that there are different views in Russia on relations with Japan and different approaches. Putin has been seen as rather benevolent towards Japan. There was a moment, I think in 2003, when he came to Tokyo, and a lot of people expected some kind of an agreement to be signed on the so-called disputed territories. It was announced in Russia under Putin that Russia recognizes the existence of this problem. It's a very different story with Putin's prime minister, former President Dmitry Medvedev. I think he made a mistake when he visited. He made, to my mind, an unnecessary visit to the Kuril Islands when he was the president, and it soured the relationship. So there are different forces and different opinions in Russia on relationship with Japan, but I think the main vector is towards cooperation. Russia wants to cooperate with Japan. The problem is that China is a lot friendlier. China offers better opportunities. China is open to dialogue. Let me again remind you that there was a much bigger problem on disputed territories between Russia and China for many years. In Mao's times, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China were close to a war because of their territorial disputes.
So your point is, Mr. Barbich,
this was resolved thanks to changes in China.
So your point is?
I think China shows by its example that it's possible to get out of the quagmire. That if you have an open, friendly attitude towards Russia, you will get what you want. At least you will have much better chances of getting it than by adopting the confrontational attitude.
Professor Watanabe, do you think Mr. Abe is ready to give this quote-unquote, as Mr. Barbich put it, the right attitude this time? The right attitude, even though that's a lame-duck president back in the United States, but there's alliance relationship over there, and Washington and Moscow certainly are not on good terms. There are two camps, in fact.
Political ideal is the ideal, but actually politics is moved in Japan and also in the United States by the economic factors, especially military industries. So when Mr. Abe has the direct talks with Mr. Putin, it is good because Mr. Putin or Russian government can do many things in the place of the United States in Syria, as was pointed out by our friend friend. Number two, Mr. Abe can play the role in promotion of the talks with Mr. Putin in the place of United States. He is happy to get more support of the people, giving the different attention to the different parts of the world. Both are happy.
I see. We hope, but we don't know how it works. Before we go, Mr. Babish, very, very briefly, 20 seconds for you, if you can. 20 seconds. What is the bottom line, or what are the bottom lines in Moscow's interaction with Tokyo?
I think Russia wants better relations, and Japan is already challenging the forces in the United States that don't want a good Russo-Japanese relationship. I think good sense will prevail, and Japan will cooperate with Russia just like Russia cooperates with China.
Very interesting. I'm not sure whether it's the real same logic, but it's certainly interesting to learn that from you, sir. Dmitry Barbich, and also Professor Takasato Watanabe. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us, and have a great weekend. Appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Inside CCTV News into your search engine, you will be able to find us. And you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next week for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night, and have a great weekend.